were striking to highlight the disastrous impact of soaring fuel prices on their survival. The chief executives of the 5 biggest oil companies justified their record profits at a congressional hearing on Tuesday. U.S. lawmakers took the executives of Exxon Mobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, ConocoPhilips, and Chevron to task for making enormous profits but investing next to nothing in renewable sources of energy. Congress called on them to justify why they got $18 billion in tax breaks last year when their profits had hit $123 billion and oil prices had reached runaway highs. The oil company representatives were testifying before the Select Committee on Oil Prices and Energy Independence. This is Congressmember Emanuel Cleaver, a Missouri Democrat, grilling Exxon Mobil Senior Vice President Stephen Simon about the $400 million severance package to former Exxon Mobil CEO Lee Raymond.
My father worked all of his life. He never earned more than $25,000 a year, and there were years that he actually worked 3 jobs. Most of the time just 2, sent 4 children to college. He's 86 years old. There will be people like my father all over the country, and I'll have some of them at a meeting next Saturday when I do my monthly coffee with the congressman. Mr. Simon, what can I say to them to help them understand how Lee Raymond received a $400 million severance package from Exxon Mobil, which translates into $141,000 a day? What do I say next Saturday to the people who come to my meeting who are struggling to get to work now because they can't afford to put gasoline in their car? Can you help me get them to understand how it's okay for Mr. Raymond to get a $400 million package, and they struggled, and the oil company profits are at an all-time high?
Well, I would hope that would be behind us by now, Congressman, but I would just point out, as we've said before.
Why?
Because that is in the past. It hasn't been here recently. But what
the gas price, we can only talk about gas prices from yesterday. I mean, everything we talk about here is in the past.
Well, I agree, but yesterday is a lot different than, let's say, when that occurred. But I believe, as we testified before, when you break down that, I think there was a misconception of how much of that was due to past, how much was due to the future, and how much was due to current earnings there, and I think it was blown out of proportion.
So you think I should tell people in my district and probably all over the country that $400 million package was blown out of proportion?
I think when you look at it, Congressman, and you break it down, and you look at that pay package relative to others that were doing the same kind of jobs, you would consider it competitive. And it was done by outside directors. There was not management involved in that at all, and they look at others to make sure we're competitive.
This is a rhetorical question. Whatever happened to Shane?
That was Missouri Democrat Congressman Emanuel Cleaver questioning Senior Vice President of Exxon Mobil, Stephen Simon. I want to play another excerpt from Tuesday's hearing. This is Massachusetts Democrat Ed Markey, the chair of the committee, also questioning Simon about Exxon Mobil's commitment to investing in renewable sources of energy.
You can't, on the one hand, be nickel and diming renewables at Exxon Mobil, and at the same time be recording $40 billion worth of profits and simultaneously fighting our efforts to move over the billions of dollars into the research in renewables, which this country needs to break its dependence upon imported oil. You cannot do that, Mr. Simon. Exxon should make a commitment that they are going to put 10% of their profits into renewables so that America has a comprehensive strategy to fight that dependence upon imported oil. Are you willing to make that kind of a commitment?
Mr. Chairman, we continue to look at that area. If we identify an area where we think it can have the impact that you're alluding to, we will do that. But we've studied all forms, even anticipating some improvements. And the current technologies just do not have an impact of any kind of appreciable impact on this challenge that we're trying to meet.
Mr. Simon, that is just going to be a continuation of a policy of tax breaks for the oil companies and tough breaks for consumers at the pump.
Democratic Congressmember Jay Inslee of Washington State also questioned the senior vice president of Exxon Mobil, Stephen Simon, about the kind of change that could be expected from Exxon Mobil when they're investing less than 1% of their profits in renewable energy.
Mr. Simon, listening to your testimony makes me even more convinced that we need to act to create an incentive for decision makers in industry to really make real investments in the clean energy revolution rather than relatively small ones. And the reason I say that is that listening to you, as far as I can tell, you're spending less than 0.5% of your gross revenues on clean energy research. Is that right?
It would be a very modest amount. I would acknowledge that, but I would not acknowledge that we're not doing a lot to address greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, considering that we have to cut our greenhouse gas emissions 80% in this country below our levels by 2050, would you agree that if your company continues on its present course, it will fall several hundred orders of magnitude short of what we have to do to prevent cataclysmic global climate change?
Well, the assumption there that that's required in order to do that.
Well, how is this going to happen? I mean, oil isn't going to all of a sudden become clean. We need to do the research to figure out these technologies.
No, but the fact is that we are going to have oil and gas and coal, and it's going to constitute about 80% of the energy equation. With that as a given, how do we then address and do what we can to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions with that being the case?
Democratic Washington Congressmember Jay Inslee questioning Stephen Simon, the senior vice president of Exxon Mobil. When we come back from break, we'll be joined by Steve Kretzmann of Oil Change International. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Back in a minute. I love the dance of the sea, swimming so fearless and free. Nature Song by Sweet Honey in the Rock here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to Oil Change International, a group that's been tracking the promises and realities of big oil companies and the obstacles in moving toward clean energy. Steve Kretzmann is its executive director. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. How important are these hearings, Steve?
These hearings are important because it gives people a chance to really see what the oil companies are saying and see the kind of duplicity that they're engaged in on a daily basis. I mean, you hear these self-serving predictions that, oh, well, oil's going to continue to be 80% of our energy mix for the next 30 years, so get used to it and we better just deal with that. And this is just, you know, it's just bunk. And I think Congressman Inslee was beginning to get to that in his comments. And people, I think, listening to that hearing yesterday could really see how out of touch the oil industry is with where the American people are and where the world is in concern about climate change. We really need to let people know how out of touch the industry is and to urge Congress to get much stronger on them in the near future.
Do you think that the questioning was strong enough, and what would you have asked?
It wasn't strong enough in a lot of different ways. Part of that is because, you know, it was a mashup of different issues around energy independence and prices and global warming, and you know, it would have been really good to have Congress drill down on the question of climate change and how we're actually going to affect the drastic emissions reductions that are very much needed, and how the industry is going to use more of its tremendous capital to invest in the alternative energy sources that are required. I mean, no company that was represented in that room yesterday spends more than 1.2% of its total profits on alternative energy. At the same time, they're spending, you know, sometimes in excess of 60% of their profits just buying back their stock and making more profits. So their priorities are clearly not about the energy transition that is increasingly what we all know needs to happen in this country. Their priorities seem to be making more money for themselves, for executives like Mr. Raymond, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's a real problem.
Why are oil prices so high?
Well, that's a complex question. And the short answer is that there's a huge global supply crunch going on, and it's not likely to get better anytime soon. if ever. There is just more and more demand, not only coming from places like China and India, which is what you hear a lot of in the press, but also even the United States. Our demand keeps going up and up and up, and there simply isn't enough supply in the system to take up that slack. And there's really no way to deal with this and simultaneously deal with the problem of climate change. I mean, the oil industry's answer to this problem is, gosh, we're addicted to oil. We have a real problem. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to find more oil. And that's what the oil industry always says, and it's just the wrong way to go about it. What we need is a very clear, strong signal from Congress that it's time to effect an energy transition. And phasing out these subsidies, getting really tough on the industry, beginning to send a very clear signal to investors, to the industry, et cetera, that the age of fossil fuels is coming to an end and that we really need to get serious about clean energy is what we need to do. And I would have liked to see more of that kind of discussion yesterday in the hearing.
Speaking of investors, how much money has the oil industry given to candidates, both at the